The fog rolled in thick that October evening in 1967, shrouding the newly docked Queen Mary in Long Beach Harbor like a burial shroud. Captain William Henderson stood on the bridge of what had once been the world's most luxurious ocean liner, now permanently moored and transformed into a floating hotel. He'd been hired as the ship's night security supervisor, a job that seemed simple enough: patrol the empty corridors, ensure the tourists were safely tucked away in their staterooms, and keep watch over a piece of maritime history. What he didn't know was that history has a way of refusing to stay buried. Henderson had sailed merchant vessels for 30 years before taking this landlocked position. He thought he'd seen everything the sea could throw at a man. But as he walked the Queen Mary's Art Deco corridors that first night, his footsteps echoing against the polished wood paneling, he felt something he'd never experienced in all his years at sea: the oppressive weight of accumulated sorrow. The Queen Mary had been launched in 1936, a testament to British engineering and luxury. For 3 years, she carried the wealthy and famous across the Atlantic in unprecedented style. Then came September 1939, and everything changed. The elegant lady of the seas was stripped of her finery, painted battleship gray, and pressed into service as a troopship. They called her the Grey Ghost then, and for good reason. She could outrun any German U-boat, carrying up to 16,000 soldiers at a time across treacherous waters. But ghosts, Henderson would learn, don't always come from the dead. His first encounter happened on what should have been a routine inspection of the ship's lower decks. The Queen Mary stretched over 1,000 feet in length, and her belly contained a maze of corridors, storage rooms, and mechanical spaces that most visitors never saw. Henderson was checking the locks on a service corridor near the old first-class swimming pool when he heard the sound of splashing water. The pool had been drained decades ago. Henderson grabbed his flashlight and pushed open the heavy door to the pool area. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty, tiled basin. The air was thick with humidity that shouldn't have been there, and the temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees. As he swept the light across the pool's depth, he could have sworn he saw ripples moving across what appeared to be water, though his eyes told him the pool was bone dry. "Hello?" he called out, his voice bouncing off the tile walls. "Anyone down here?" The only response was the distant groan of the ship's hull settling against its moorings. Henderson shook his head and backed out of the room, but as he turned to leave, he heard something that made his blood run cold: the unmistakable sound of a woman laughing, echoing from the empty pool behind him. That was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, Henderson began documenting the strange occurrences in a leather-bound logbook he kept locked in his desk. The entries started simple enough. October 15th, heard unexplained sounds from drained swimming pool. Investigate further. October 18th, lights in Queen's salon flickering despite recent electrical inspection. No cause found. October 22nd, guest in stateroom M340 complained of cold spots and sensation of being watched. Checked room, nothing unusual found. But as autumn deepened into winter, the entries became more disturbing. November 3rd, found wet footprints leading from the pool area to the Grand Salon. No plumbing leaks detected. Footprints disappeared after approximately 30 minutes. November 8th, multiple guests reported hearing children playing in the corridors at 3 a.m. Security cameras show empty hallways. November 12th, encountered figure in 1940s naval uniform near the engine room. When approached, figure vanished. No personnel in that area. Henderson began to research the ship's history more thoroughly, spending his off hours in the Long Beach Public Library, poring over maritime records and wartime documents. What he discovered chilled him more than any midnight encounter. During her service as a troopship, the Queen Mary had carried over 800,000 military personnel. But it wasn't just the living she had transported. On October 2, 1942, while zigzagging through submarine-infested waters off the coast of Ireland, the Queen Mary had accidentally rammed her escort cruiser, HMS Curacoa, cutting the smaller vessel in half. 338 British sailors died in the frigid Atlantic waters that day, their bodies never recovered. The Admiralty had kept the incident classified for decades. The families of the dead were told their loved ones had died in service to their country, but the truth was far more tragic. Henderson found testimony from survivors describing how the Queen Mary, traveling at full speed and under radio silence, couldn't stop to rescue survivors. The risk of U-boat attack was too great. They left their own escorts to die in the churning sea. But that wasn't the only tragedy the ship had witnessed. Henderson's research uncovered incident reports from the Queen Mary's troopship years. In 1943, a young sailor named James Morgan had been found dead in his bunk, apparently from natural causes, though some witnesses reported seeing him arguing with an unseen presence the night before his death. 3 months later, Seaman First Class Robert Chen had disappeared during a routine patrol of the lower decks. His body was never found, and the official report listed him as absent without leave, though fellow crew members insisted he would never have deserted. The most disturbing discovery came when Henderson found a classified report from 1944. During one particularly crowded crossing, carrying 15,000 American GIs to Europe, a fire had broken out in one of the lower compartments. The official report stated that the fire was quickly contained with no casualties. But Henderson found a letter from a medic who had been there, writing to his wife about the screaming that went on for hours and how they had sealed the compartment to contain the fire, even though we could hear them pounding on the doors. The letter mentioned that 13 men had been trapped in that compartment. 13 men whose deaths were never officially recorded. Armed with this knowledge, Henderson began to understand what he was dealing with. The Queen Mary wasn't just haunted, she was a repository of maritime tragedy, a floating tomb that had absorbed decades of fear, desperation, and unfinished business. The manifestations began to intensify as winter deepened. Henderson's logbook entries became increasingly frantic. December 1st, third report this week of guests seeing children in the corridors. Descriptions consistently match: young boy, approximately 8 years old, wearing shorts and suspenders. Always appears near the former nursery area. December 5th, kitchen staff refuse to work alone in prep areas. Report knives moving on their own, pots and pans falling without cause. Temperature in kitchen drops to 45 degrees at random intervals. December 10th, guest in stateroom B474 found room flooded with seawater despite being 3 decks above waterline. No plumbing issues found. Water tasted of salt. Guest reported seeing a man in naval uniform standing at foot of bed before awakening to find room flooded. Henderson's breaking point came on December 15th, during what should have been a routine midnight security round. He was checking the ship's former ballroom, now used for special events, when he heard music, a big band playing what sounded like Moonlight Serenade. The melody was faint but unmistakable, accompanied by the sound of dancing feet and muffled conversation. Following the sound, Henderson found himself drawn to the ship's original dining room. As he approached, the music grew louder, and he could make out individual voices laughing and talking. The conversation had a distinctly 1940s cadence, formal, clipped British accents mixed with American drawls. Henderson pressed his ear against the dining room doors and listened. He could hear a woman saying, "Charles promised we'd be in New York by Thursday. Do you think we'll make good time?" A man's voice responded, "With Jerry's U-boats prowling about, I'd rather arrive late than not at all." Taking a deep breath, Henderson pushed open the doors. The dining room was empty, but not silent. The music continued to play, though no orchestra was visible. More disturbing still, Henderson could see indentations in the carpet, footprints, and the circular impressions of dancing couples, moving in slow waltzes across the floor. The temperature in the room was so cold his breath came out in visible puffs. As he watched, transfixed, a champagne glass on one of the tables suddenly lifted into the air, tilted as if someone were drinking from it, then gently set back down. Other glasses followed suit, an entire invisible party toasting some long-ago celebration. Henderson stumbled backward, his heart hammering. As he reached for the door handle, a voice spoke directly behind him, a woman with a cultured British accent. "You shouldn't be here, dear. This is a private party." He spun around, but saw nothing except the continuing phantom celebration. The dancing impressions in the carpet moved closer to where he stood, and he felt an icy presence brush past him. The voice came again, this time right in his ear. "We've been waiting so long for the ship to dock. When do we reach New York?" Henderson fled. He ran through the corridors, his footsteps echoing behind him like pursuing ghosts, until he reached the safety of his office. There, hands shaking, he poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and tried to process what he had experienced. The logical part of his mind, the part trained by 30 years of practical seamanship, insisted there had to be a rational explanation. Old ships made strange noises. Temperature fluctuations were common. His eyes could have been playing tricks in the dim lighting. But Henderson knew better. He had felt the presence in that room, had heard voices that belonged to passengers who had sailed these waters decades ago. The Queen Mary wasn't just a retired ocean liner, she was a time capsule, preserving moments of human experience like insects trapped in amber. Over the following days, Henderson began to piece together the puzzle. His research revealed that the dining room had been the site of a farewell party on September 3, 1939, the very day Britain declared war on Germany. Passengers who had boarded expecting a pleasure cruise found themselves on the Queen Mary's final peacetime voyage. Many of those revelers would never see home again, torpedoed on other ships or killed in the London Blitz. The Phantom Party wasn't just a random haunting, it was a moment of joy frozen in time, endlessly replaying the last carefree hours before the world changed forever. But the most disturbing revelation was yet to come. Henderson's investigation into the ship's wartime service led him to a classified Admiralty report he found in the archives of a maritime museum. The document, marked secret and dated March 1944, detailed an incident during one of the Queen Mary's troopship crossings that had been completely buried by military censors. According to the report, the Queen Mary had been carrying 14,000 American soldiers to England when she encountered a German U-boat wolf pack in the North Atlantic. The ship's captain, following standing orders, had begun evasive maneuvers while maintaining radio silence. But during the frantic zigzagging, a catastrophic accident had occurred in the ship's lower decks. A group of soldiers, packed into what had once been a luxury storage compartment, had been thrown against the bulkhead when the ship made a sharp turn. The impact had ruptured a steam pipe, filling the sealed compartment with superheated vapor. By the time the crew could cut through the locked doors, 18 men were dead and dozens more critically injured. The incident was classified to prevent damage to morale, and the families of the dead were told their loved ones had died in enemy action. The bodies were buried at sea during a somber ceremony that none of the other passengers were allowed to witness. But Henderson discovered something else in that report, something that explained the escalating paranormal activity on the Queen Mary. The compartment where the accident had occurred was directly below the ship's current guest quarters. Stateroom B474, where the guest had awakened to find his room flooded with seawater, was located precisely above the sealed tomb of those 18 soldiers. Armed with this knowledge, Henderson began to understand the pattern of the hauntings. The spirits weren't randomly scattered throughout the ship, they were tied to specific locations where tragedy had occurred. The children reported in the corridors appeared near what had been the ship's nursery during civilian service, where young passengers had sailed to what they thought would be safety in America. The naval figures in the engine room were the ghosts of crew members who had died maintaining the ship's vital systems under wartime conditions. And the woman in the swimming pool. Henderson's research revealed that during the ship's conversion to troopship service, the drained pool had been used as a temporary morgue for passengers who died during the crossing. The laughter he had heard wasn't celebratory, it was the hysterical laughter of someone who had lost their mind to grief. Henderson's discoveries took on an urgent importance when he realized that the paranormal activity wasn't just increasing, it was becoming dangerous. The incident reports in his logbook showed a clear escalation. January 8, guest in stateroom A145 reported being pushed down the stairs by invisible hands. Suffered broken wrist and mild concussion. January 12, kitchen fire started without apparent cause. Sprinkler system activated, but witnesses report flames burning in impossible patterns, forming shapes that resembled human figures. January 15, multiple guests reported elevator stopping between floors and doors opening to reveal empty elevator shafts. 3 people injured attempting to exit. The Queen Mary's ghosts were no longer content to simply manifest, they were actively interfering with the living world. Henderson realized that something was driving them to more aggressive behavior, but he couldn't determine what had changed. The answer came during a late-night research session in the ship's own archives. Henderson had been granted access to the Queen Mary's original blueprints and construction documents, hoping to find more information about the compartment where the steam pipe accident had occurred. What he found instead was a series of modification reports from the ship's conversion to a hotel. During the renovation process, workers had discovered several sealed compartments that weren't shown on any official blueprints. These spaces had been welded shut during the ship's wartime service, their existence erased from all records. The renovation crew had opened these compartments to install modern ventilation systems. Henderson's blood ran cold as he read the workers' reports. In one compartment, they had found the remains of 13 men in military uniforms, exactly matching the number from the medic's letter about the fire. In another, they had discovered the skeletal remains of what appeared to be civilian passengers, including 3 children. But the most disturbing discovery was in a compartment located deep in the ship's hull. Workers had found evidence of what could only be described as a mass grave, the remains of dozens of people, military and civilian, all apparently sealed in during the ship's wartime service. The renovation crew, following instructions from their supervisors, had quietly removed the remains and turned them over to military authorities. The compartments were then cleaned, retrofitted with modern systems, and sealed again. No record was made of the discoveries, and the workers were sworn to secrecy. Henderson realized with growing horror that the recent escalation in paranormal activity coincided exactly with the renovation work. By disturbing the resting places of these forgotten dead, the construction crew had awakened something that had been dormant for decades. The spirits weren't just haunting the Queen Mary, they were trapped aboard her, unable to rest because their deaths had never been officially acknowledged. They had been erased from history, their sacrifices forgotten, their families left to wonder what had become of them. But Henderson's investigation was about to take a personal turn that would test his sanity and his courage. On the night of January 20, 1968, Henderson was conducting his usual security round when he encountered something that defied all his previous experiences. As he walked through the ship's promenade deck, he noticed that his footsteps were echoing strangely, not just bouncing off the walls, but seemingly answered by other footsteps walking in perfect synchronization with his own. Henderson stopped. The echo stopped. He took a single step forward. Somewhere behind him, he heard another single footstep. Turning slowly, Henderson saw a figure at the far end of the corridor, a man in a 1940s merchant marine uniform, identical to one Henderson himself had worn decades earlier. The figure was too distant to make out clearly, but something about its posture and bearing was unsettlingly familiar. "Who's there?" Henderson called out. "This is a restricted area." The figure began walking toward him, and as it drew closer, Henderson felt a chill of recognition that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold that always accompanied the ship's apparitions. The man approaching him looked exactly like Henderson himself, but Henderson as he had been 30 years earlier, young and confident and alive with the promise of a life at sea. "You know who I am," the figure said, its voice a perfect echo of Henderson's own. "The question is, do you know who you are?" Henderson stumbled backward, his mind reeling. This wasn't possible. He was alive, healthy, standing right here in 1968. But the figure approaching him looked exactly as he had looked when he had first gone to sea in 1938, the same year the Queen Mary had begun her regular Atlantic service. "I don't understand," Henderson managed to say. "Don't you?" his younger self replied. "Haven't you wondered why you took this job? Why you were so drawn to this particular ship? Why you can see and hear things that other people miss?" Henderson's memories began to shift and blur like sand in an hourglass. Images flashed through his mind, not of his life as he remembered it, but of another life, another death. He saw himself as a young merchant marine officer aboard a ship in the North Atlantic. He remembered the torpedo striking amidships, the cold black water rushing in, the desperate scramble for lifeboats that would never come. And he remembered the Queen Mary, appearing out of the fog like a gray ghost, too large and too fast to stop, her captain following orders to maintain course and speed despite the cries for help from the water. "The HMS Curacoa," Henderson whispered, the memory crashing over him like a wave. "I was on the Curacoa." His younger self nodded sadly. "You've been on this ship for 25 years, William. Ever since that day in 1942 when she cut us in half and left us to drown. You just forgot for a while, lost yourself in the comfortable fiction of a life you never lived." Henderson sank to his knees as the full truth hit him. He wasn't the night security supervisor of the Queen Mary, he was one of her victims, one of the 338 sailors who had died when the great liner collided with their escort vessel. Everything else, his 30 years in the Merchant Marine, his retirement, his job on the Queen Mary, was an elaborate delusion, a story he had told himself to avoid facing the reality of his own death. "But the other ghosts," Henderson said, his voice barely a whisper. "They're real. I've seen them, documented them." "Of course they're real," his younger self replied. "Just as real as you are. This ship is full of the dead, William. We're all here together, all trapped by the same tragedy, the same unfinished business. The difference is that most of us remember what we are." Henderson looked around the corridor with new eyes. The polished wood paneling seemed to shimmer and fade, revealing glimpses of gray military paint beneath. The modern lighting flickered, occasionally replaced by the harsh glare of wartime blackout bulbs. The Queen Mary was showing him her true face, not the luxury hotel she had become, but the gray ghost she had been during the war, still sailing through dark waters, still carrying her cargo of the dead. "Why now?" Henderson asked. "Why am I remembering now?" "Because someone needs to tell our story," his younger self said. "For 25 years, we've been forgotten, erased from history, our deaths covered up by military censors and government bureaucrats. But you've been documenting everything, haven't you? Writing it all down in that logbook of yours?" Henderson thought of the leather-bound journal locked in his desk, filled with months of carefully recorded paranormal encounters. But now he understood its true purpose. It wasn't a security log, it was a testament, a record of all the forgotten dead who haunted the Queen Mary's decks. "What happens now?" Henderson asked. "Now you have a choice," his younger self replied. "You can continue the delusion, keep pretending you're alive, keep filing your reports that no one will ever read. Or you can accept what you are and help us find peace." Henderson closed his eyes and felt the weight of 25 years of self-deception lifting from his shoulders. When he opened them again, he was no longer looking at his younger self, he was looking at a mirror, seeing himself as he truly was, a ghostly figure in a 1940s naval uniform, translucent and shimmering with otherworldly light. But with acceptance came purpose. Henderson understood now why he had been given the gift of partial memory, why he alone among the Queen Mary's ghosts could interact with the living world so convincingly. He was meant to be their voice, their chronicler, their advocate for justice and remembrance. Over the following months, the paranormal activity on the Queen Mary took on a different character. Instead of random manifestations and dangerous encounters, the spirits began working together to tell their stories. Guests reported seeing elaborate scenes from the ship's past, soldiers saying goodbye to sweethearts, children playing in corridors that had long since been converted to other uses, crew members going about their duties with dedication and pride. Henderson, now fully accepting his nature as one of the ship's ghosts, began appearing to living visitors who had the sensitivity to see him. But instead of frightening them, he told them the stories, the true stories that had been buried by official secrecy. He spoke of the HMS Curacoa and the 338 sailors who had died in the collision. He told of the soldiers who had perished in the steam pipe accident, of the civilians who had died during wartime crossings and been buried at sea without ceremony. Most importantly, he ensured that their names were not forgotten. Working through sensitive visitors and sympathetic researchers, Henderson began the process of creating a proper memorial for all those who had died aboard or because of the Queen Mary. The ship's management, initially skeptical, found themselves dealing with an increasingly organized effort to acknowledge the vessel's darker history. The turning point came when a team of maritime historians, guided by Henderson's ghostly testimony, uncovered official documents that corroborated every story he had told. The collision with the HMS Curacoa, the sealed compartments full of remains, the covered-up accidents, all of it was verified through archival research and forensic investigation. In 1975, 7 years after Henderson's awakening to his true nature, the Queen Mary finally received her memorial wall, a bronze plaque listing the names of all those who had died in connection with the ship during her wartime service. The ceremony was attended by surviving family members who had waited decades to have their loved ones' sacrifices officially recognized. Henderson watched the ceremony from the ship's bridge, no longer alone. Around him stood the spirits of hundreds of other sailors, soldiers, civilians, crew members, all of them finally at peace now that their stories had been told and their deaths acknowledged. One by one, they began to fade, moving on to whatever comes after, their unfinished business finally complete. But Henderson remained. Even as the other spirits found their rest, he chose to stay aboard the Queen Mary, serving as guardian and guide for future generations of visitors. He understood that his work wasn't finished. There would always be more stories to tell, more forgotten lives to remember, more truths to uncover. To this day, visitors to the Queen Mary report encounters with a kind, elderly man in a merchant marine uniform who appears in the ship's corridors late at night. He doesn't frighten them. Instead, he tells them stories about the ship's magnificent past and tragic history. He speaks of the brave men and women who sailed aboard her, of the sacrifices made in service to others, of the importance of remembering those who have been forgotten by official history. The staff at the Queen Mary have long since stopped trying to explain these encounters. They know that some stories are too important to be dismissed as mere superstition, and some guardians too dedicated to ever truly leave their posts. Captain William Henderson continues his eternal watch aboard the Queen Mary, no longer a security guard but a keeper of memories, ensuring that the voices of the dead are never again silenced by the bureaucracy of the living. In death, he found a purpose more meaningful than any he had known in life: to serve as witness and advocate for all those who had been erased from history's pages. The Queen Mary sails on, permanently moored but never truly at rest, carrying her cargo of stories and souls through the endless night of memory. And Henderson walks her deck still, a ghost among ghosts, making sure that no one who died in service of others will ever be forgotten again. For in the end, that's what ghosts truly are: not malevolent spirits seeking to frighten the living, but the voices of those who died with something left unsaid, some story left untold, some truth left buried in the archives of official denial. They are history's witnesses, demanding that their testimony be heard and their sacrifices remembered. And aboard the Queen Mary, in the gray hours between midnight and dawn, those voices still echo through the corridors of time, telling their stories to anyone brave enough to listen. Hey everyone, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like and subscribe button, and then share it with your friends. Your support helps us grow and create even more awesome content. We appreciate you being part of the journey.